The moment I stepped into the grand hall of the Charleston estate, silence fell like a stone dropped in water. Conversations paused, forks froze midair, and a dozen eyes turned toward me with a mixture of boredom and mild disdain. I didn't belong here, not in their eyes. Their gazes slid over the charcoal suit I had pressed carefully that morning, the scuffed leather shoes I had worn for years, and the modest pearl earrings that had once belonged to my mother. I stood among them like an outsider who had lost her invitation but walked in anyway. The Bennett family's annual financial conference was meant to be a celebration of wealth, power, and influence. To them, I represented none of it. I took another step forward. A cough disguised a chuckle. Near the fireplace, my cousin Blake murmured something to Victoria, who tilted her head back in laughter, then turned to me with a smile too sharp to be genuine. I could hear it, whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear without claiming responsibility. Did she forget this isn't a charity event? Brad, my Uncle Richard's golden child, leaned forward in his chair and said loud enough to cut through the room's tension, "Look who finally made it, the underdog in a clearance rack blazer. You're not seriously thinking of voting on company assets in that outfit, are you?" I didn't flinch. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the conference table, unclipped the brass latch on my leather portfolio, and laid it carefully on the polished wood surface in front of me. I met every pair of eyes that dared to mock me and said nothing. Not yet. Because they had no idea what was inside that briefcase. No idea what I had built quietly, methodically, away from their cocktail parties and luxury yachts. I had come prepared for war. Not with weapons or insults, but with numbers, deeds, and truths. And when the time came, they would see it. Every dollar, every title, every ounce of power they thought I lacked. They had spent years laughing at the poor cousin. Today, they were about to find out who I really was. My name is Eliza Bennett. 32 years old, born into the most prestigious family in Charleston, yet raised on principles the rest of them discarded long ago. My father, Thomas Bennett, was the youngest son of Elizabeth Bennett, a woman who built our family empire on discipline, patience, and the unshakable belief that real wealth should serve, not dominate. He married my mother, a kindergarten teacher with no pedigree and no fortune, but a heart so full of integrity that even my grandmother approved. That approval, however, didn't extend far. To the rest of the family, my mother was a liability and I was a mistake born from love rather than strategy. After my parents died in a car accident when I was 15, I moved into this very estate, not as a granddaughter but as an obligation. The whispers followed me everywhere. "She'll never be one of us. She's here out of pity." I heard them at dinners, in hallways, behind closed doors, and sometimes even in open rooms when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I paid attention to everything. My grandmother, Elizabeth, never joined the chorus. She took me into her study late at night and taught me how to read financial reports like novels, how to trace investment trends the way some trace bloodlines. She handed me a ledger instead of a trust fund, a copy of Benjamin Graham's work instead of a credit card. I wore hand-me-downs while my cousins drove Porsches. They got beach houses on their birthdays. I got her handwritten notes on compound interest and neighborhood revitalization. By 18, I was quietly studying finance at a state university on scholarship, working 2 jobs, and investing every leftover cent into what others ignored. Duplexes in transitional neighborhoods, commercial lots near rezoning boundaries, properties passed over by flashier investors, but rich in long-term value. I never put anything in my name. Every deal went through anonymous LLCs established by Grandma's old attorney, Mr. Winters, who honored her memory by protecting her last pupil. Meanwhile, my cousins grew up with a different curriculum. Brad became the face of our family's real estate brand, though his only skill was ordering drinks at charity galas. Blake claimed to run a tech firm, but mostly hosted rooftop parties. Victoria curated an art collection no one had heard of. Jessica, the only one with a heart, became a pediatrician and kept her judgment to herself. Unlike them, I never wore labels on my sleeve. I bought my clothes for their stitching, not their brand. I lived in a small downtown apartment where every wall I painted and every tile I replaced reminded me of purpose. I drove a 10-year-old Toyota not because I couldn't afford more, but because nothing about my life was performative. I did not need them to see me. I needed them to underestimate me. That was the plan all along. Because sometimes the best place to grow is in the shadows, where no one is watching. And I had grown into something they were not prepared for. The night before the conference officially began, I arrived at the estate just as the sun dipped beneath the moss-draped oaks. My Toyota crunched over the gravel driveway, dwarfed between a new Maserati and Aunt Catherine's pearlescent Mercedes. I stepped out with deliberate calm, clutching my leather bag like a shield. Inside the house, everything was as I remembered it: polished wood, gold accents, floral arrangements that changed daily, and a smell of lavender and old books. Martha, our long-serving housekeeper, opened the door before I reached it and pulled me into a hug. She smelled like lemon oil and cinnamon, just like the afternoons she used to sneak me cookies when I was 15 and crying into my textbooks. "He's been rearranging the schedule," she whispered, referring to Uncle Richard. "Met with the family attorney all afternoon. He's up to something." I nodded, not surprised. Richard had turned what used to be a weekend of reflection and unity into a power play disguised as a business retreat. My old room, preserved like a shrine, welcomed me in silence. The pale blue walls still held the same bookshelves, the same photograph of me and my parents at Cape Cod, the same desk where Grandma first taught me how to track moving averages. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photo and whispering, "They want to sell it, Grandma. This house." A knock broke the moment. Jessica stood at the door, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater worth more than my car. She smiled gently. "Figured you'd be here early. Just wanted to warn you, Richard's going to push the vote to sell. He's already lining up support." My stomach twisted. "He wants to sell the mansion?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Jessica stepped in, closed the door behind her, and sat beside me. "He's calling it asset reallocation. Says we need to modernize the family portfolio." I stared at the floor. "And they'll all fall in line?" "Most already have," she said, eyes soft with apology. "Votes are weighted by declared holdings, remember? He controls almost 40%. I knew this. It was Richard's idea to weight voting power based on contribution to the family's collective wealth. An elegant way of silencing those who didn't fit the mold. People like me. That evening, at the formal welcome dinner, the divide was crystal clear. The dining room sparkled with crystal glasses, silver flatware, and the scent of truffle risotto. Richard sat at the head where Grandma once presided, retelling the story of a development deal he'd closed ahead of schedule and under budget. The family responded with practiced admiration. "We had to turn away buyers," he boasted. Aunt Catherine chimed in about her latest fundraiser, casually noting my absence from the donor list. Brad made a show of listing specs on his new car. 9-month wait list. Got mine in 3. The perks of being a Bennett. He turned to me. "Still driving that antique, Eliza?" I nodded. "Still reliable." Patricia, Richard's wife, offered a sugary smile. "You know, dear, if you'd let Richard help you with your investments, you might upgrade a bit." I kept my tone even. "I'm comfortable with my lifestyle." The conversation turned colder after that. Each remark a small incision. Mentions of country clubs I didn't belong to. Vacation homes I'd never visited. Private schools for children I didn't have. They didn't mock me with venom. They did it with polite cruelty, hidden behind napkins and wine glasses. I endured it all, sipping water while they toasted success, reminded with each passing minute why I had come. After dinner, I walked to Grandma's rose garden. The lights glowed soft against the trimmed bushes and marble bench. I sat there, inhaling the night, and whispered aloud, "They think they can erase you, Grandma. They think they can bury what you built under steel and glass." I closed my eyes and made a vow. No matter what it took, I would protect what mattered. This house, her memory, and the truth of what it meant to be a Bennett. Even if I had to tear down the illusion they had built to do it. Saturday morning arrived crisp and golden, sunlight cutting through the lace curtains of my childhood bedroom. I dressed carefully, selecting black slacks and a simple blue blouse, tailored just enough to fit well but modest enough to go unnoticed. The grand drawing room had been rearranged overnight. Gone were the portraits of our ancestors that used to line the walls, replaced with sleek renderings of modern condominiums. Rows of chairs formed a half circle facing a projector. At the front stood Uncle Richard in a dark Italian suit that probably cost more than my first property acquisition. He smiled like a man about to sign a triumphant deal. Eliza, he said with mock warmth, good to see you joining us. We're just beginning the conversation around family standards and brand alignment. I nodded and took my place beside Jessica, who gave my hand a quick squeeze. The air buzzed with anticipation, but I felt strangely calm. Richard began his presentation with the usual fanfare, graphs, logos, photos of gleaming towers in New York and Miami branded with the Bennett Holdings seal. Wealth, he said, pacing confidently, is a narrative we write with intention. Our image is currency, and perception, our strongest asset. His gaze landed on me as he spoke that last part. The implication wasn't subtle. Then he shifted to the main event. The screen filled with an image of Grandma's mansion, taken from a flattering angle in golden hour light. This residence has served our family for generations, he said, voice dipping into faux reverence. But nostalgia is not a business model. This property sits on 5 acres of prime real estate, valued at $48 million. A redevelopment opportunity. Aunt Victoria raised her hand, her expression all concern and performance. Before we go on, perhaps we should acknowledge Eliza's attachment to the house. She did live here, after all. Then she turned to me with a smile that barely touched her lips. But surely you understand that sentimentality should never obstruct growth. Before I could reply, Blake jumped in. Speaking of growth, has anyone seen my new roadster parked out front? Limited edition. 20 made for North America. Laughter rippled through the room. Richard nodded approvingly. Now, that is the kind of bold statement that sustains our brand image. He moved to a slide titled Disposition and Distribution, and began describing how the sale proceeds would be divided, emphasizing the phrase weighted by contribution. Developers sitting in the back began passing out glossy brochures showcasing the proposed luxury complex, glass towers, rooftop pools, valet service, all stamped with the Bennett family crest. The ROI is substantial, Richard concluded. Unless there are objections, we'll proceed with a preliminary vote after lunch. I raised my hand. The room paused. Richard's smile thinned. Yes, Eliza? I stood, voice steady. Before we vote, I believe we should revisit Grandma Elizabeth's intent for this house. She often said not every investment is about financial return. This mansion was meant to be our anchor, a place where legacy lived. Richard shook his head. The market has changed. Sentiment doesn't pay property taxes. Aunt Catherine laughed gently. Darling, with your limited experience in high-value real estate, perhaps this isn't your lane. I didn't blink. Actually, I've conducted a full neighborhood valuation. The historical designation of this property elevates its long-term worth. Demolition would remove that status. Conversion into a cultural asset, like a foundation headquarters, would preserve value and purpose. Brad rolled his eyes. Foundation headquarters? Eliza, come on. You rent a downtown apartment. You're not even in the game. He snorted. Analysis from someone who hasn't bought a house. I turned toward him. My housing choices are intentional. He interrupted. Just like your 10-year-old car? Some of us make deliberate moves. Others pretend poverty is strategy. A few cousins chuckled. Richard stepped in, not to stop the ridicule, but to keep the meeting on track. Let's proceed with the vote. We can finalize figures tomorrow. The votes went as Jessica predicted. Every hand but hers and mine went up in favor of selling. My heart sank, not just from the result, but from the confirmation that I had never mattered in their calculations. They weren't just willing to erase Grandma's legacy, they were proud of it. Jessica found me afterward in the rose garden. I'm sorry, she said, sitting beside me on the cold stone bench. They're blinded by numbers. It's not about the house anymore, I said quietly. It's about being seen. And in that moment, something hardened inside me. The humiliation had done its work. I no longer wanted their acceptance. What I wanted now was to make them see me, not as a burden or a footnote, but as someone who had already surpassed them, while they were too self-absorbed to notice. I had one last card to play, and I was ready to use it. Sunday morning brought with it a colder air, the kind that slices through silk and sentiment alike. The drawing room had transformed once more. Gone were the brochure stacks and digital renderings. In their place stood a long mahogany table, each seat marked with a leather portfolio embossed with the Bennett crest. Richard presided at the head, naturally, his voice already filling the space as I arrived. Today, he declared, we conduct the individual asset review and finalize updates to our family's financial hierarchy. Everyone took their seats, eyes already flicking through spreadsheets that detailed who owned what, and more importantly, who mattered. My name appeared in small print, tucked into a corner, with a 2% voting weight beside it, just enough to be acknowledged, but not enough to be heard. I noted with quiet disgust that Richard had inserted a proposed amendment to streamline Grandma's protections in the family charter, protections designed to keep one person from consolidating control. He called it administrative efficiency. I called it exactly what it was, usurpation masked as strategy. One by one, the peacocks spread their feathers. Brad presented his promotion, bonuses, Aspen property, and new investments. Blake spoke about his upgraded yacht and how he was considering a wine label next. Victoria waxed poetic about rare art acquisitions and the waiting list she bypassed for her children's private school. Each presentation was met with nods, murmurs of admiration, and validation. When it was my turn, I stood without fanfare and walked to the front with my slim folder. I began my usual speech, modest consulting growth, steady returns from various holdings. No one paid attention. Brad scrolled through his phone. Victoria adjusted her earring. Uncle Richard checked his watch. I paused, letting the silence stretch until they began to fidget. Yesterday, I said, some of you questioned my understanding of real estate. Some even implied I didn't belong at this table. I placed my hand over my portfolio and continued. But while you were measuring success by flash, I was building something else. Quietly, strategically, thoroughly. I opened the folder and pulled out a bound valuation summary, handing it to Richard's assistant. I'd like this displayed, please. The projector flickered to life. A single number appeared first, $73 million. The room froze. That, I said evenly, is my current net worth. No one moved. Then Brad laughed, short and bitter. No way. That's impossible. I assure you, I said, handing out copies of my complete holdings, it's very possible. 15 properties, including 3 commercial buildings and 12 residential units. One of them, in fact, is the luxury apartment complex where several of you currently live. Gasps and whispered curses spread like fire. I walked over to Victoria and laid the ownership document in front of her. So when you complained about lobby renovations and guest policies, you were complaining to me. Blake sputtered. You raised my rent. By 12%, I said. Still below market average. Uncle Richard recovered first. Even if this is true, it doesn't change the voting structure. You still only hold 2% of declared shares. I nodded. That was before this morning. I placed a final document on the table, an incorporation deed. As of 9 a.m. today, I've transferred all my holdings into Elizabeth's Legacy Trust. That trust now owns Jenkins Development, which, through quiet acquisitions over the past 3 years, has amassed a 30% stake in Bennett Family Holdings. Richard went pale. You bought Jenkins? I did. And with my original 2% and Jessica's 5%, I now control 37%. Enough to block any major transaction, including the sale of this house. The silence was absolute. Jessica let out a soft, stunned laugh. Well played. Brad stood, face flushed. You tricked us. You manipulated the system. I turned to him. I followed Grandma's rules. The ones she wrote. The ones you all twisted. Richard was already recalibrating, his tone shifting from disdain to diplomacy. Perhaps we could revisit our strategy. A more collaborative approach going forward. I'd consider that. I said coolly, if we begin by restoring Grandma's original principles, stewardship over status, value over vanity. Victoria looked as if she might cry. Brad looked like he wanted to punch something. I felt none of the triumph they expected. Only the quiet satisfaction of truth exposed. The vote to sell the mansion was no longer on the table. The mansion would stand, and so would I, not as the poor cousin, not as the afterthought, but as the woman who outplayed them all. Quietly, completely, with the one weapon none of them had learned to wield, patience. A week later, the mansion no longer echoed with the voices of entitlement and champagne toasts. It stood quiet, dignified, and untouched by the developer's draft plans now sitting unsigned in Richard's briefcase. I had returned to the estate, not as an intruder among elites, but as its rightful steward. The first project under Elizabeth's Legacy Trust began that Monday, transforming the estate into the headquarters for a nonprofit foundation in Grandma's name. The Elizabeth Bennet Foundation would support financial literacy and affordable housing programs for under-resourced communities, the very causes Grandma had once whispered into my ear when showing me the charts of rising neighborhoods. I did not publicize my holdings or trumpet my newfound control. There were no press releases, no TV interviews. But word spread quietly, just enough to unsettle the family's hierarchy. Invitations began arriving, not to charity galas I once stood outside of, but to serve on advisory boards, to speak at panels, to review grant proposals. My calendar shifted from being ignored to being requested. Still, I lived in my small downtown apartment. Still, I drove my Toyota. Every choice, deliberate. Every compromise, avoided. At our next family gathering, Easter brunch at Aunt Catherine's Country Club, I arrived as I always had, modestly dressed, no entourage, no car valet ticket needed. The difference this time was visible in their eyes. They no longer laughed when I approached. Brad nodded stiffly. Victoria muttered a greeting. Richard offered me a seat beside him, an olive branch wrapped in linen and catered charm. Over our meal, he leaned toward me, voice low. I must say, I underestimated you. I simply sipped my water. Grandma used to say, people with real power never have to declare it aloud. He smiled awkwardly, then tried again. Perhaps there's room for collaboration. The family could benefit from your insights. I didn't respond immediately. I glanced around the table, watching them try to reconcile the version of me they had built in their minds with the one now sitting before them. Only if that collaboration begins with integrity, I finally said. Otherwise, we're just recycling the same decay under a shinier roof. Outside the window, I noticed a few children running across the golf course lawn. I imagined Grandma watching them, imagined her approval not for the money I'd amassed, but for the way I had used it, not to conquer the family, but to redeem what they had nearly thrown away. Back at the estate, a new bronze plaque had been installed beside the front gate. It read, Elizabeth Bennet Foundation. Wealth is not what you show. It is what you grow. Martha had cried when she saw it. I had cried later, quietly, in the same rose garden where Grandma had once knelt beside me, pressing seeds into my palm and saying, with patience, this becomes more than what it seems. The irony didn't escape me. They had mocked me for years for being too small, too quiet, too poor. But it was in that very quiet that I had done the most. My revenge was never loud. It was rooted, methodical, inevitable. I had grown something they couldn't see, until it towered over them all. On a warm afternoon 6 months later, I found myself once again in the rose garden, seated on the same stone bench where Grandma used to sip tea and review spreadsheets with me. The estate was alive in a new way now. Children from local schools were touring the halls, learning about budgeting and investing in workshops hosted inside the rooms where my relatives once debated vacation homes. Community organizers walked past the parlor with folders under their arms, coordinating the next affordable housing grant. The house hadn't been sold. It had been reborn. Martha found me there, a cup of tea in her hand, her steps slower now but still steady. She sat beside me without a word, the way she always had when I was a grieving teenager, lost and out of place. She visits me sometimes, she said quietly. Miss Elizabeth. In my dreams. I looked over at her, surprised. She nodded. Last night, she was sitting right here. Clear as anything. She looked at the house, then at you. Said, she remembered what they forgot. That legacy isn't marble and stock prices. It's what we leave that makes life better for someone else. My throat tightened. I didn't speak. I couldn't. She knew you would do this, Martha said. You never needed their approval. You just needed time. I looked out across the garden where the roses bloomed in layered red, Grandma's favorite. My hands folded in my lap. No longer clenched in defense. I was not angry anymore. I was not broken. I was not invisible. What I had built not to prove myself to those who refused to see me, but to honor the one who always had. The one who saw my potential before I had a portfolio. The one who taught me that true wealth was the ability to choose your path without compromise. And in that moment, I understood fully that I had not just defended her legacy. I had become it, quietly, unshakably, entirely.